Do you feel personal guilt for your unconscious bias or privilege? Hassan is on the line from Slough. Welcome back, Hassan.
Hi, assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Thanks for having this conversation as we enter Black History Month. I think when you ask the question, who is in a more privileged position, is it Diane Abbott or a white working class guy? And
in a council estate.
The answer, the answer is obvious. It is actually Diane Abbott. Because we, in the last 60 years, we as BAME communities have actually broken through barriers. We're reaching higher places that we could never envisage about 60 years ago. Yeah. And if there is some hesitation in answering your question, who's in a better position or not, there is a certain type of political philosophy that says Black and BAME communities are always going to be permanent victims of white supremacy, and they will never be able to progress until the system of white supremacy or capitalism comes down. I totally disagree with that. Over the last year or so...
Because what would replace it, Hassan?
Sorry?
Well, because what would replace it as well in that situation?
Yeah, well, I think what should replace the current discourse in America, for example, where they're talking about critical race theory, and you would have heard of Robin DiAngelo starting from the premise of white guilt, white self-deprecation and flagellation. They should start from a premise of commonality. There are more things that unite human beings in a rich diversity of cultures. That's the conversation we should be having.
And that's a way, Hassan, to move the conversation on. It's still important, obviously, as you no doubt agree, that racism exists, but we've made some progress, and we are able to... I recommend listeners, by the way, to look at the works of Fathallah Muqaddam. He's a Georgetown University professor who, this thing about focusing on commonalities, his theory is called omniculturalism, and he's saying we need to move from the multiculturalism model that focused on our differences and move towards what he calls omniculturalism, focus on our commonalities. Because I'm very glad, and I think listeners need to hear somebody like yourself, Hassan, say it as frankly as you did, that, it seems quite obvious that a member of parliament, regardless of their gender or skin colour, has more privilege than somebody living on a council estate. It's quite an obvious thing, and yet we find it now, because of this discourse, unable to answer it in that straightforward way. Exactly,
because they need to... Some people who have a certain agenda need to push the idea that we're going to be permanent victims, and that is why after the killing of George Floyd, when there were protests, and I really was in tune with the conversations around this, I came out with 2 books to address this head on, and I sent you both copies actually.
Thank you.
And because I feel very, very strongly about this, we are actually breaking through. And when you say that we should exercise our critical thinking, that's what it's all about. It is exercising critical thinking rather than the critical race theory, which has plagued America and is about to enter the UK, which divides people. I'm glad you mentioned that particular academic. I never heard of that person about the commonality of human beings, but that's the discourse we should be having. And at work, I'm involved with diversity and inclusion. And when I run these sessions, I always say 2 things. Number one, that diversity and inclusion isn't always limited to BAME people. There is a diversity of white cultures, as there is a diversity of Asian and Black cultures. They should be celebrated, and we should be, together. And secondly, these D&I conversations are a safe space when I run them. If they have any questions or concerns about certain aspects of our culture, or maybe about Islam and Muslims, women wearing hijab, etc., they have the right to ask and challenge, and that's how I run it. And I think we can grow as people when we have this.
Well done, Hassan. Thank you very much, because I think it's important people hear somebody like you that does this training and stuff. It's important to hear them say this. Even my friend, say, June Sarpong wrote a book on Diversify, but she made sure to include a chapter on the white working class need for diversity there as well, because we all know, right? So if you speak with a certain, say, Cockney accent or Essex accent, where I'm from, or if you are of a certain class background and went to state school, then there are also these barriers there. And obviously people do point to from an intersectional lens and say, okay, but if you had a Black working class man and a white working class man both on the council estate who'd experienced racism, well, that's a very, very specific question. Yes, of course, racism is real and it exists, but we've got to work out a way to bring people together and help people move forward together, because when you get to that stage and you're comparing on that level, you're comparing somebody that doesn't have much with somebody else that has slightly less than much, and they pretty much both don't have much to their name, and it feels a bit unfair, especially if the person engaged in that discourse is in an ivory tower in a university or a member of parliament. It feels a bit bullying. So thank you, Hassan, for calling to clarify your views on that. It's really helpful that people hear that.